Welcome to the Super Healthy Human Podcast with your host, Dr. Roger Murphy.
Hi, Aimie. I am so looking forward to spending some time with you. This is a subject that, number one, I don't think a lot of people really know that much about. And what they do know, I think, is probably tainted. So I think this podcast episode is really going to be enlightening for a lot of people that have an interest in this, and even the people that may not think they have an interest in trauma. Once they start hearing some of the things that you're going to share with us today, it's going to have some meaning that's probably going to resonate with them.
Mm-hmm. I agree. This is something that we can no longer ignore. It's been misunderstood, and I think that it's been labeled as something bad. And so we haven't known what to do with it. And if we don't know what to do with it, why talk about it? And so it's time to talk about it. It is time to talk about it.
Well, let me ask you. So I shared a little bit about your bio, but tell us a little bit more, how you got interested in trauma and healing, and a little bit about your background, where you came from and where you're at now.
Yeah. So I would have been one of those people, Roger, who never would have identified with having had trauma. Never. And it was during my medical school years at Loma Linda University. I was also doing a master's in biochemistry at the time, had a little gap in between getting done with that master's and going back into what would have been the third year of medical school. And so in that gap, I'm like, you know what? Why don't I foster parent? And it was something that I always.
Why not? You don't have anything else to do, right? I mean, med school and yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, exactly. You're getting to know me already, Roger. And it was something that I would say that I had always felt some type of calling to. I don't know what other word to use for that. And so decided to foster parent, got my home ready, went through all that process. And the first child that they placed with me ended up being this 4-year-old Miguel, who I adopted 6 months later. And that really changed my entire world. Yeah. What I expected to have happen was that he would settle in. He would be so transformed, maybe by the stability, by being loved, that he would do great. And when he continued to reject my love, and have just obviously very significant emotional and behavioral issues that were getting worse with time, not getting better with time, I'm like, all right, something is going on here. And what is going on in that brain of his? What can I do to help support his healing? Because he's headed for a really, really life if this is how he's going to be showing up in the world. And so just asking those questions of what is going on in this brain of his kind of opened up this whole Pandora's box. And certainly what we'll be talking about today is like, it's actually not in the brain. Most people think that trauma is psychological and that it's in the brain. It is not. It is actually in the body, in the nervous system. And that is what drives all of our behaviors. But more importantly, especially for this conversation today, it's what ultimately drives our physical health. And so there are health symptoms and then health conditions that a person will start to develop. And there are some that are so strongly associated with this trauma response. And people just need to know about it, because if that's part of their story, then if they're not addressing that component, it's going to be so much harder, if not impossible, to really get to that level of health that they're looking for.
Well, first of all, I salute you for being a foster parent and now adopting Miguel. I think that's just, there's a special place in heaven for people who are foster parents and who adopt children. I think there's such a need for that. My niece, her and her husband they were foster parents, and they ended up adopting these three small brothers, three brothers that were 4, 6, and 9 at the time. And they were, as most boys that age, wide open. But they, 6 months into it, they just fell in love with these boys. And it took 2 years before they could ever get everything worked out with the parents and everything they went through with adoption agency. But I've kind of seen what they've gone through. I mean, it's it's a lot of work. It's a labor of love. So I salute you for doing that. But going through that led you into then wanting to help others that had really didn't have the tools, I guess, really, or the understanding to be able to help either themselves or a family member be able to deal with some of these traumas that they experienced early in life. So where are you now? So I know you're in Southern California in a clinic. Tell us a little bit about that, but you're planning on moving. I understand you'll be moving to do some really neat work down in Mexico.
Yeah, I am. And it's funny that you kind of bring back those families, because that's where I started. And so it was after my experience with Miguel that, I was first led to form a nonprofit, and I started running weekend family intensives and putting on these weekends that were very experiential. So I would do a little bit of teaching on, hey, you guys, here's the science behind what's going on in these kids' brains. And now we're going to actually go out, and as a family, you're going to be doing these, different activities, and you're going to start to notice, when my child reacts this way, this is what's going on in their brain. And this is the tool that I need to use in this moment to help address exactly what's going on in their body. So that's where I started. And then from there, it has molded into, wait a second, like, it's not just kids, right? Like these experiences that we have in our lifetime, even if we don't look back and think that they are trauma, what is really important, and I know we'll go deeper into this, is just what the experience was like at that time, and how old we were at that time, what our resources were at that time. Was it traumatic at that time? Not now looking back, but in that moment. And there are a lot of things that we can go through in life where at the time they feel overwhelming. And once we're through them, we're like, oh, that, I'm okay. That was okay. But at the time it was overwhelming. And so then I started to notice all of these people, adults, coming into, at the time I was a general surgery resident. And so there were a lot of people coming in with a lot of different symptoms and complaints and issues going on. And I started making all these connections, like, wait a second, like, this is so much of what I am learning about with trauma in the body. And even though it looks different, like, these people are having more of a physical health manifestation of internal stress, of internal shame, of trauma. And so that then led me more into, wait a second, like, this is really what I want to do. So I switched from surgery into preventive medicine and addiction medicine, and started for my medical career working more with adults. And so, yes, I still do run a 20-bed medical detox unit. So detoxing people off of alcohol, off of all kinds of drugs, the street drugs, the prescription drugs, all of that. And absolutely love what I do. And then what I've also done now is kind of bring all of this trauma stuff into my work, because until we know how to address it, again, we're just going to plateau with our health, with our emotional states, with our relationship patterns, with our health patterns, everything. And we're just going to kind of be this revolving door of repeating the same things over and over, because that's what our nervous system does when it has these trauma patterns. So located here in Southern California at the moment. And yes, I've been building a retreat and treatment center down in central Mexico for the last 6 years now, Roger. And finally, it is all coming together this year. And I'm going to be ready to start bringing down groups of people who want to do this kind of stuff, right? Be able to address their health issues through a trauma perspective and really get results faster. So what I do is help accelerate that healing journey by being able to understand the biology of trauma that's playing out in their body, and how to not only address it, but actually use it as leverage points for really promoting that rewiring of the nervous system that needs to happen after trauma.
So, I think maybe we should define trauma, or talk about when we're talking about trauma. I think you and I are on the same page, working with patients who have that history. But for those that are listening or watching this podcast, when you say trauma, you work with people that had trauma, that could be a whole host of different things, right?
Yes. And this is where the story does not matter. And this is also why I love what I do with trauma, is because we don't have to go back into the story. We don't have to compare. Well, they had a worse childhood than me, so I shouldn't be this affected. I should be able to just, pull myself up and not let it affect me, not let memories, not let people affect me. And yet at the end of the day, we still see that they're affecting us, right? So yes, what is trauma is a great place to start. And when we start to see its effects on the body and what actually happens in the biology in response to trauma, it becomes very easy to define. And it really is anything, for whatever reason, that it doesn't matter. Anything that for whatever reason overwhelmed us. And by overwhelmed, I mean it actually overwhelmed our biology. It overwhelmed our sense of being able to respond in a way that will protect ourselves. And so we get overwhelmed. We go into like this, it's a low energy state. It's kind of a collapse. It's a burnt out state, right? So people who experience burnout, that's actually overwhelm, and that's actually a trauma response happening in their biology. So it's anything that for whatever reason, and there's always lots of different reasons, that it overwhelmed us in the moment. And so you can see that we have this stress response, and then we have our trauma response. And most people just really understand the stress response. And so we say, that fight, flight, or freeze is our stress response. And that's actually one of the biggest misunderstandings around trauma, because the stress response is only that fight or flight. It's a very high energy. I'm actually moving. I'm taking action for self-protection, whether that's fighting or that's running. Either way, I'm taking action. And the freeze is a completely different state of our biology, completely different state of our nervous system. That is trauma. And so anytime that a person experiences, or that, they're coming to me and I'm seeing in them like, hey, I know you don't think that you've had trauma, but you're showing trauma patterns in your nervous system, then we know that they would have experienced this type of overwhelm, where they would have gone into what I call a chronic functional freeze, where they're still getting through their day, but they've lost their joy. They've lost their zest for life. They've lost their passion, their excitement to get up because of what they're doing that day. They feel blah. And they're going through the motions. And they, feed the kids, they go to work, they get stuff done, but they are in a functional freeze state and living a lot of their life in this trauma place without ever even knowing it. So trauma in its simplest definition is anything, for whatever reason, that overwhelmed us.
So with my fibromyalgia patients, something that I've specialized in about 20 years now, what I see is those individuals, they have a low plasticity for stress, just the way God created them, this genetics, the way they were born. And something, this is typical what we see is in fibromyalgia, this community, is they've had a stressful childhood. That's not always the case, but oftentimes, this is something, if you go back and you look at their childhood, you'll see that they had a very challenging childhood. It could be, an abusive household, physically or sexually. It could be maybe they were battling some illnesses or dysfunctional home, or maybe they moved a lot. But you kind of go back and look at their history, you can see that they were under all this stress, all this trauma, traumatic events. And as they get into adolescence and then on into young adults, something comes along, the straw that breaks the camel's back, some type of stressor. It could be a chronic stress that just finally they snap, or it could be an illness or a surgery. But it really, and it really doesn't matter when we talk about trauma, whether it's real or imagined, right? Once the body breaks down, and I think that's a medical term, it's broken, right? Broken down. It can't really, the autonomic nervous system that kind of controls everything, like our little computer, it just kind of shuts down. And like you said, these individuals, they're kind of just, getting through life, but that's about it. They're really pretty miserable on the inside, right?
Yeah. And you're exactly right. This is a very common association that we have with fibromyalgia, is this challenging childhood. And I love how you phrase that, right? There were challenges. And when we think of a young child going through those challenges, right? Even just with that, like I immediately get like so much compassion for that little child who had to be moving around a lot, who would not ever feel like they should make a close friend because they knew that they were going to lose the friend, or that maybe their parents or parents, mom, were just emotionally not fully present. They were busy, they were distracted. All of that stuff, Roger, like it all can create an experience, a felt experience of overwhelm for a young child who feels lost in life. They need that guidance. They need that closeness. They need that leader. They need that someone who knows them, who sees them, who loves them with all that they see in them, right? The the good and the bad, like all of it, right? But is fully known, is fully seen, and fully loved in that. And not just that, but then guided and supported, and be able to come to them with conversations around, hey, my friend just did this, what should I do? And there's so many of people who ultimately later on in life have symptoms like fibromyalgia where they didn't have that type of relationship in their childhood. And for that, it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming to have to try to figure out life by themselves, right? A lot of people even talk about having to kind of feel the emotions of their parents and adapting to what was going on in the room in order to, keep things okay or not get in trouble. And that, for a young child to have to learn how to read the emotional states of people who are supposed to be supporting their emotional states, that is overwhelming. And so this is what we see happening, is that it starts to form these trauma patterns in the nervous system. And by trauma patterns, I mean going into this overwhelmed state where there is some benefit there, and we can talk about the benefit there, but we go into this trauma place, and then that starts to kind of have these downstream effects on our biology. So there's increases in oxidative stress. There are increases in mitochondrial compromise. And they start small, and then they build over time, so that decades later, when they have this major stress, they have a car accident, they have a big, loss in their life, someone dies, or they lose a relationship that was important to them, or they get, bit by a tick, they get exposed to mold, whatever the major stress is, that's then what breaks them, right? And just everything unravels and falls apart. And it's not that was the one thing. No. It was building for years because of the trauma patterns that were in their nervous system, and those consequences that then paint the picture and lay that framework for a major stress coming in and being what breaks them. Whereas for other people who didn't have that accumulation of the biology of trauma, would have been able to have a mold exposure and it not break them, would have been able to have that car accident and they recover well. And so it's this understanding that, yes, like we can usually pinpoint it to, this is what changed my life. Even something positive. Sometimes I've had some people who that was what happened after they had children, right? But when you think about the accumulation of the changes in their biology over decades because of these trauma patterns that were wired in during childhood, and then you go through something like pregnancy where your nutrients are being depleted, your nutrients are being pulled into supporting this new life, and then it's too much for your body. It is just too much for your body, and it goes into this crash, right? And the crash is now constantly living in that emotional state, in that nervous system state of trauma. Whereas before a person gets to that stage, they're going back and forth between stress and overwhelm. But after that, big stress, or maybe just over more time, then you see that pattern they're just staying in overwhelm. And fibromyalgia is one of those conditions: chronic pain, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, autoimmune. Those four are conditions that are strongly associated with living and being in that freeze, in that trauma response state of the nervous system. It's quite fascinating.
So someone gets in this state, this traumatic freeze,
Yeah.
where their nervous system is hypervigilant. It's on overload oftentimes. So we see that would drive autoimmune, that would drive central pain sensitivity syndrome, where that tactile sensation is picked up more readily and turned into pain, or the nervous system is so overwhelmed that little things that normally wouldn't bother them years ago, or certainly wouldn't bother you and I, it sets them off. Loud noises, bright lights, things that we take for granted. An individual that's kind of in that traumatic freeze, they can't handle that. They get to the point where they're just overwhelmed by any kind of stimulation.
And this is how we know it's so much of this is being driven by the nervous system, is because we see, wait a second, it's not only your symptoms of the pain, of the aches, of, the fatigue, it's also this hyperstartle response. It's also the sensitivity to bright lights now. It's also all of this sensory stuff, and anything sensory is the nervous system. And so it just starts to make things very clear how much the nervous system is driving and a part of the story of our physical health and conditions, which gives us a lot of hope, right? Because then when we know that it's the nervous system, all right, let's go in and let's work on our nervous system. Whereas other people without this knowledge would still focus on the musculoskeletal system, right? Or maybe they're even focusing on the adrenal glands because they understand that, well, this is related to stress. Well, the adrenal gland support is great for stress, but we're no longer in stress. We are in complete overwhelm. And so we need to actually support the nervous system, especially the mitochondria, in the overwhelmed state, and actually bring it out of that. And then we can support the adrenals. Then we can bring on this other stuff. But yeah, just this understanding that stress and trauma are very different things. And that, this fibromyalgia is an accumulation that has led to a permanent state of overwhelm on a cellular level, which then, we experience that on an emotional level.
So a lot of people watching this are thinking, well, I had a difficult childhood, and, I don't feel like I have any kind of trauma issues.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to share is that, hey, it's all connected, whether it's fibromyalgia or it's Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or it's, Reiter's or Sjogren's or lupus. I mean, you've got when the body breaks down, it doesn't matter, what you call the illness. When the body breaks down, it can't self-regulate itself. And that's where we start to see these symptoms, these warning signs. What are some of the things that you see in your practice when you're working with people that had trauma? What are some of the physical manifestations of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it makes me think of Camille, right? So Camille came through our 21-day journey program, and she was one who had this diagnosis of fibromyalgia. She had also had some of her thyroid antibodies being off, not to the point where she needed medication, but definitely what I'm telling her is like, hey, you are on an autoimmune path. Let's work on getting you off. But her main struggle was just these aches and this fibromyalgia pain points. And so where I start with them is actually more on the lines of working directly with their nervous system, because their physical health symptoms are so much being driven by the nervous system that when someone then is given the tools to, in the moment, be able to shift that state of their nervous system. We only have 3 states of our nervous system. And so being able to have those tools to know how to shift their nervous system within a few minutes, their physical symptoms can get better. She did not mention this coming in, but as we started doing this work, she started mentioning like, wait a second, I'm not having the abdominal pain that I was having. And I was like, wait a second, abdominal pain? You didn't tell me about abdominal pain. Oh yeah. It's been this background thing for years where, sometimes I'll have just these cramps, or I'll have bloating, or I'll have this pain that shows up right underneath my ribs, and I never know what it is. It drains my energy. I have to, take naps when that happens. And I'm just noticing that all of that is less. And I even had Jude. So Jude the other day also had just finished the 21-day journey out 20 days ago. And she just shared with me yesterday how she has not been able to floss her teeth for years. And she was now able to floss her teeth. And I'm like, we never even talked about this, right? Like, you came in for these other health reasons. What are we talking about with your teeth? And it's like, they were always so hypersensitive.
Yeah.
And so any touching of them was just so painful. And she's noticing that now, after doing some of this work with her nervous system, she's able to floss her teeth without that pain. And even she felt that there was so much tension in her jaw that she was carrying, and that has gone away. So there's all these physical symptoms that a person can have. And this is where it really depends so much on their prior injuries, sometimes their genetics. But then, when we look at the nervous system and how much it drives, it can drive certainly our muscles and how tight they are, or just how loose they are, right? If we have no tone, well, that's a problem, right? That's the nervous system. But if they're too tight, well, then that's also the nervous system. The digestive system is a huge area of our body that's completely driven by our nervous system. And so whatever's happening in our gut is a direct reflection of what's happening in our nervous system, and whether we are in that stress state or whether we are in the trauma and that overwhelmed state. Headaches, and I would say just even some of the fatigue, right? Like, you can see people, their posture, and whether they are more open, whether they are feeling secure in the world because of how they carry themselves, or if they're more down and they're feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. They're feeling the weight of the responsibilities. That actually, even just that posture, Roger, is something that is a direct reflection of the nervous system and that freeze response. And so people, I had Irina, and she was going through the 21-day journey, and halfway through, she's like, people are telling me that I look different, that I'm standing different. And I can feel it now. I can feel that when I sit down, like I'm not only more present, but my shoulders are back. And because of the pain that I've been having, I've always just kind of sat forward and hunched my shoulders and kind of protected my stomach, and, been in a position where I can rub my legs because they hurt, because they ache. So there's all these kinds of physical symptoms that are a result of this chronic stored trauma in the body. And it's quite fascinating to see what those symptoms are for each person, and then how that changes and starts to shift when they actually start working with their nervous system in a way that's safe, that they don't have to go into the story. And it really is just giving them tools that they can shift back into a state of their nervous system where they feel safe and secure. And what a gift for their body, right? Especially, I think of people who have fibromyalgia, and so much of this is my story, right? Like, I had my health crash, and that's where I had to come face to face with, you know what? I know you don't think that you had trauma in your childhood, but you clearly have trauma patterns wired into your nervous system. And so much of this is not wanting to be in our body, right? I'm sure that you hear people saying that. It's like, my body hurts so much. I feel like my body has betrayed me. This is not who I want to be. This is not the life that I want to be living. I want to be out hiking mountains. I want to be out traveling. I want to be out playing with my grandchildren. And my body feels like it's betraying me because of its limitations and the pain. And this is all part of what is part of this trauma response that gets wired into our nervous system and creates this biology of trauma. And so having the tools to start to shift that is such a gift for someone who can now actually relax and be in their body and not hate their body because it's not betraying them anymore. Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine having this conversation 30 years ago? 40 years ago?
No.
Maybe 20 years ago? Maybe,
No.
maybe 10 years ago? So as a medical doctor, with your training, that, it's definitely a little bit different than my training for sure. But this whole idea about how trauma can manifest itself as a physical entity, whether that's, whatever that is, whatever you want to call that condition. But
Yeah.
we think of trauma as you mentioned earlier, as a mental illness that, hey, just get over it. Or,
Right.
you're mentally
Go to therapy, go
traumatized.
talk about it.
Right. Just talk
Mhm.
therapy and that type of thing.
Yep.
But what you're saying is that this trauma is stored in the body, and over a period of time, it begins to take its toll. For some people, obviously it's more of a, potential issue than others. But if you're one of these individuals that you're kind of just the way God made you, you're kind of, that's a weak link for you. These stressors keep coming and coming and coming, and you break down. And then you just can't handle life anymore. So what are the, when you take somebody in, what are some of the things that they're going to do in the 21-day program? What is it that brings this individual back to life, that comes to you with, pain and fatigue and headaches and probably anxiety issues, mood issues, maybe some brain fog? What are the steps that need to happen to get this person back on track?
Yeah. And Roger, I love just what you said, like bringing them back to life, because that's how they feel. And so one of the biggest frustrations for me going through my medical training, right? And I went to a medical school that of all the medical schools was the most focused on this, whole person model. And yet when the limitations of what we knew at that time were just like, okay, yes, we understand that there's this emotional component to a disease. So when you're seeing someone, what you should do is send them to a therapist. Like that's literally like the solutions, right? And that was considered, Roger, was considered, wow, we're doing advanced work in medicine, right? Like we are addressing the emotional component of a person's disease and their symptoms by bringing it up, acknowledging it, and sending them to therapy. And what I noticed is that people were rarely getting better. In fact, when I sent them to therapy, talking about it seemed to cause flare-ups of their symptoms. They would come back and they would have a flare-up of their autoimmune. They would have a flare-up of their fibromyalgia symptoms. And so again, like I'm kind of sitting here scratching my head being like, what is going on that talking about it, sending them to therapy, them having these big emotional experiences because they're going back into their story, they're going back into their childhood, they're going back into that time when there was some sexual abuse or, a traumatic event or a natural disaster where they truly like felt fear for their life. What is it that then is resulting that I'm seeing this connection with a flare up and an actual increase in their symptoms and their physical health symptoms? And so that is where I really started to tackle the trauma component and realized, wait a second, you're right. Just like you said, it is stored in the body. Trauma is stored in the body. And so when we just talk about it, we bring it up without having the tools to resolve it. And so here our body has been like, I'm going to sequester it, and some people will even understand that there are some emotional connections to certain organs, right? And so the body is saying, well, that is too painful, so I'm going to sequester that in the liver, right? Or that is way too painful, that hurts so much. I don't think that I would be able to survive if I let myself feel the intensity of the pain of that betrayal, of that abandonment, of that loss. And so I'm going to just keep that stuck here in my muscles, in my, wherever it is. And so we can have this trauma stored in our body. Now, it really is stored in the nervous system and the patterns that it creates of going into this overwhelm. But then it's like, well, then how is talking about this going to help this trauma that is stored in the body? And that's where the logical mind, as much as it helps us and serves us, is limited in its ability to resolve this thing that has become the wiring of our nervous system, of our survival system. And so here again, we talk about it and we put ourselves back into that same emotional state in that event or that whole experience of maybe it was my whole childhood, right? And we put ourselves back into that emotional state without the tools to actually resolve anything. And so, yes, that is a huge stress on the body. We've put it back into this whole survival state, and you're going to experience a flare up of your symptoms. So how do we address this? So this is where I went to the board and I'm like, all right, what can I do to help my people? Because this is what I personally experienced in my own life, where I would go to therapy and I'd have a flare up of my autoimmune and my chronic pain stuff. Oops, that's not good. And so I started to get trained in different trauma therapies. And I found the therapies that I was seeing as a medical physician. I am seeing the best results. I am seeing that, wow, this is actually changing the nervous system in front of my eyes, right? This is actually helping. This is actually bringing down physical health symptoms, even though it's a trauma therapy. So then I started to incorporate those trauma therapies into my work. And so now what I do is that when people come to me, that is where I start with them. So I start them on a 21-day journey of teaching them how to understand, recognize which state of the nervous system they are in. Are they in parasympathetic, which is your, I feel safe, I feel secure. Most people don't even remember what that feels like, honestly, Roger, right? Especially if they've got fibromyalgia. Yeah, I haven't been there in years.
Yeah.
Are you in the stressed and sympathetic state, or are you in the overwhelm and freeze and trauma state? And once we can recognize which state you are in, let me give you tools. I want to empower you with tools so that you're not relying on going in to see a therapist, but that you have tools in the moment to shift that to a more parasympathetic state, which is going to promote your best health. Whatever your best health is, and it's different for every person, right? Based on everything. But whatever your best health is, you're going to get there by spending more and more time in parasympathetic. And so you need tools to do that in the moment. And that's why I think people are experiencing such transformation when they do this 21 days with me, because they're not having to wait, 5 days for their next appointment with their therapist. They're able to do this on their own. They are given tools that they've never had before to work with their body on a whole new level. And they don't need to go back into the story. They don't need to rehash it. They don't need to reanalyze it. They don't need that. Like, we can literally just be like, all right, what's going on in your body right now? What state of the nervous system are you in right now? And here are tools, and let's do this together. Here are tools to shift you back closer to that parasympathetic state in 2 minutes, and then you're done. Right? And then you're done. And yes, you're going to need to do this multiple times a day, especially at first, but then this just becomes part of your life. And certainly as someone with fibromyalgia, this is what I would want for them to just incorporate into their daily life eventually, are these types of tools and exercises and movements of knowing how to work directly with their nervous system, so that for that day and for their future, that they can have their best health possible.
Great. So in this 21-day program, is it you're giving them the tools, and so this is self-help. They're able to do some self-help exercises, some therapies. Is there diet? Is diet related to this? And what about nutraceuticals or nutrition? Does that play a role in this 21-day process?
That's a great question. And this is where I start people. This is not where I end people. So the nervous system is such a driver for everything else that I start them on this 21 days of learning their nervous system, learning how to shift it. So they've got daily exercises that they do by themselves. I also do group exercises, so they have that group connection once a day. So it's a pretty intensive journey into their nervous system. It's very experiential. I do teach, right? But the focus of this course is the experience and creating a different felt experience in the body, and then being able to see how that changes their physical health, even just in those 21 days. And then what happens is that it plateaus. And they've done enough of the work that they can do with their nervous system on that level, but then their nutrients, their diet, their microbiome, their mitochondria are now the limiting factor in being able to shift and rewire more of this trauma that's stored in the body. And so then that's where we go next. And so we look at then what are the lowest hanging fruits for you in your biology that we need to address first? What are those points in your biology that are now actually keeping you stuck in this trauma response, so that we can address that? And then now we're working on both sides. Now we're working with the nervous system and these biology things, the diet, the sleep, the nutraceuticals. There are three most common biochemical imbalances, especially with fibromyalgia. Copper excess is one of the most common biochemical imbalances that I'm seeing. Undermethylation, pyroluria are some of the others, but that copper imbalance is huge. So we're bringing in that biology piece. But first, I do start with that 21-day journey so that they can just even get a new baseline with their health. And then that makes it clear for us, do they need lab testing? Do they not need lab testing? Because the next steps for the biology piece is very clear, is very apparent. And we can then jump into addressing what I call the biology of trauma.
So really interesting. I mean, it's a very thorough, well thought out journey that you've put together.
Yes.
It sounds like. And, what I see with my patients is the first thing that's got to happen is you've got to calm down that nervous system.
Exactly.
If you don't, they're always vulnerable. And
yes.
I use this analogy that we're all born with a stress coping savings account. And in that stress coping savings account, we have certain chemicals that allow us to deal with stress, hormones and B vitamins and magnesium, minerals, these different things that allow us. Anytime we get under stress, we have to utilize these chemicals that drive our physiology to be able to handle the stress. But if we get run down, as you've talked about, with this trauma, maybe that took years, but then the straw, that broke the camel's back was the death of a loved one or something. Now what's happened is you have bankrupted these chemicals. Your nervous system is shot. So you're on hyper vigilant alert all the time. And until you calm that down, you're really not going to have an opportunity really to make the big necessary changes, positive changes that you need to make.
Exactly.
So we're, really on the same page. You do it more with these, which I think is fantastic, with these self-help therapies that you're talking about. I do it more biochemically, looking at place I start with my patients is sleep, and then balancing the neurotransmitters. But we're definitely on the same page. You've got to get that nervous system calmed down. If you don't, it just drives everything in the wrong direction.
Exactly. Yep.
Well,
love the work that you're doing, Roger.
Oh, thanks. Well, so as we finish up, one thing I want to ask you about. So you work with all ages and all types of trauma, and you also work with individuals right now, I guess, with addiction. Who are the toughest individuals to work with? What type of patient is the toughest?
The toughest patients are the ones like me, who are so strong-willed that we think we know it all. We've got our idea of what's wrong, and we're not that receptive to new things and new ideas.
So the type A, the overdoer, the
type A, yes. And what my people learn about a lot is, how that's actually a methylation problem. And so I am an undermethylator, and as part of that, I'm very strong-willed, very driven, and will drive myself into sickness. And so it takes a lot of pain for me to be like, oh, okay, this is not working. Let me do something different. But as long as I can keep pushing myself, I will. Right. And so those are both the toughest and the funnest patients for me, because it's my story, right? Like, it's like, yep, I recognize myself, and let's do this. And I know that they're going to want to grab onto this. I know that they're going to want to be intense about this, right? Because that's how the type A strong-willed people tend to be. It's like, all right, we're going to tackle this. Yes. And we also need to change that pattern in the nervous system, right? Because that's what contributed to the stress. And honestly, we haven't even, been able to dive into this, so I'll just mention it, but there are genetics. There are things that will make us more predisposed to experiencing overwhelm and trauma, right? If you have even just genetics that compromise your detoxification system, your oxidative stress levels are going to be higher and higher with the stress, and will be pushing you into the overwhelm and trauma, as opposed to someone else who has a great detoxification genetics. And so there are all these components that all come together. And for me, like those are the funnest patients, is being able to put all the puzzle pieces together. But the toughest patients, I would still say, are those undermethylators like me, who we wait a long time before being willing to change and address trauma. We don't want to.
Yeah, so it's the type A that they just do and they do and they do and they do, and
yes, and until they can't, until their body actually crashes.
Yeah. And eventually they're done out, right? So yeah,
right.
Well,
right.
This is, it's fascinating talking about it. It's all connected.
It is.
You can't separate the parts. It's all connected. And I want to encourage people to check out your website and see some of you got a lot of free resources on there, a lot of great information. And the website that I had went to was Dr. Aimie, AIMEE.com. Is that where they should go to learn more about kind of what we've been talking about?
Yes. And let me, the actual spelling of my name is AIMIE. Did I
say that wrong? I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. Yeah, okay. It's different. It's unusual. So yes, it's Dr. and then Aimie, and I spell Aimie, AIMIE. So draimie.com.
I don't know why I did that. I put a second A. Okay, there we got it. Right. So, and then from there, I think you've got another site too that they can go there, and then they can navigate to another site. I mean, there's
yeah. Right. From there, they'll see all the different resources, whether they prefer to watch videos. I've got the YouTube channel. Whether they prefer to read, I've got blogs. And if they're interested in looking at the programs, the 21-day journey, there'll be links for that over onto the Trauma Healing Accelerated website for that.
Great. Well, Aimie, this is great. I could talk this stuff all day because I just think it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating how we've just got this innate, inborn healing dynamo that we're born with, and it can get off track. It can shut down, you can break down, and it shows itself in many different ways. But what we've talked about today, to me, makes the most sense. This whole thing about trauma and burnout. I mean, it's just something that, it's epidemic. You just see it around the world. People are they're just done. And
it is the new epidemic. Yeah.
And you're giving them an opportunity, hey, let me throw you a lifeline if you're in that boat, and, if you're out of the boat, and let me show you how you can use some self-help things to start dealing with it. So that's great. Thank you so much. This has been fun.
It is fun. And Roger, I just want to commend you for the work that you're doing. Such awesome work. And what an honor for me to be here with you today.
Thank you so much.